Welcome to another edition of the Outstanding People podcast. I'm your host, Slade Abisror, and thank you so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. I hope you're having a wonderful week, and I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'm very thankful for our guest today. I have a really great one for you. Captain Chris Cassidy. He is a United States Navy veteran. He spent 10 years in Navy Special Operations as a Navy SEAL officer. He was in Afghanistan and earned 2 Bronze Stars for his leadership and service there. And then in 2004, Chris applied for and was accepted to NASA's Astronaut program, where he spent over 377 days in space. He eventually became NASA's chief astronaut, and Disney actually made a documentary about him called Among the Stars, a really great documentary. If you're looking for something to watch, go check that out. Chris is he's an amazing guy who has given his life to service, and he currently serves as the CEO and president of the National Medal of Honor Foundation, where he's building a iconic museum, leadership institute, and a monument to memorialize and honor our Medal of Honor recipients. So really a great cause there. A lot to talk about, a lot of great stories. If you're into space, if you're into Navy SEALs, this is going to be a great episode for you. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Hey, Slade, great to be with you. Thanks for your time.
It's really a pleasure. And we're taping this the week of Thanksgiving, so I just want to say a special thank you to you for all that you do. It's really an honor to have you here.
Happy Thanksgiving to all the listeners.
Thank you. So I'm a huge fan of NASA. Just growing up, I remember going to my best friend's house. We would sit on top of his roof at night. We'd look up into the sky. When I was in the Navy, I would spend countless hours working nights on top of the flight deck of the USS Independence, and I'd look into the stars. I was, on the Persian Gulf. It's pitch black outside, and I would just watch satellites go by. I love that. And there's big news lately with NASA with the Artemis 1 and the whole project that's going on to send people back to the moon. I was just curious if, watching that, does it make you a little homesick for your old job?
Homesick maybe is not the right word. I'm really super proud of all. In fact, I just wrote to one of the flight directors and said, hey, from a former NASA guy in the cheap seats, I'm just really proud of you. What you're doing for our nation and sending this thing to the moon. How cool to see these images and think about my colleagues, my former colleagues, that on the next Artemis mission will be looking out those windows with their own eyes. So it's just a really exciting time in our nation's space history right now. You've got all this activity with commercial space, and we can talk about that. And now the Artemis mission with the sight on the moons and the front sights, and then off to Mars in the longer distance. Just a lot going on, and super proud to be an American right now.
Yeah, it really is a great time, for a fan of NASA or anybody involved in the space program to actually put boots back on the ground on the moon. It's really an incredible feat. And I think I was reading they were putting the first person of color and the first woman to step on the moon. So that it'll be really exciting. It'll really to watch this whole journey. And I think there's an Artemis 2 and an Artemis 3 that will be going out. So looking forward to that. I do want to talk a little bit about your journey and how it started. You obviously were part of the Naval Special Forces, a SEAL, an astronaut. What do you get more questions about it, being a SEAL or being an astronaut?
I guess it depends on the venue that I'm in. A lot of people are curious how you pee and poop in space. So there's a lot of questions about living. I say that in jest, but in general, the living aspect in space, people can picture how you brush your teeth and how you do all the normal things on Earth, and they want to know what it's like to do that in zero gravity. So probably a few more questions in that regard than my time in the military. But depending on the crowd, it could swing very quickly to SEAL team questions.
Oh, that's crazy. How to go poop in space. I didn't think about that one, but now I'm curious. I
get asked so often that I made a YouTube video. You can type Chris Cassidy space toilet and go into all the gory details that you're interested in knowing.
That's awesome. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, growing up and kind of what it was like you grew up in Salem, Massachusetts. Is that correct?
I was born there, but I really grew up in southern Maine, small town
Oh,
in Maine.
okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then where did you find this drive to, like, this no quit attitude? Because, obviously, to be a SEAL, to be an astronaut, these are extraordinary things. Do you remember a time in your life, in your childhood, what maybe it was something, a defining moment, or the way your parents raised you, but where did this drive to just do the impossible come from?
I don't know, to be honest with you. It wasn't something that I look back and think, oh, there was that moment, or I've always been inspired to do. I think if I really take a hard look at my fabric, I would say I have this kind of fear of letting people down that I
Mm.
love and care for, teammates, colleagues, family members, and that probably was with me from the early stages. And
Hmm.
it wasn't like as I was a young kid, it was I wasn't always trying to do the most outlandish things. I was just trying to do my best at what I was doing. And then I found myself in the 80s, nobody knew about the SEAL teams. I didn't. It
Right.
wasn't until I got in the Navy, I showed up at the Naval Academy, that I saw my first trident, my first SEAL pin on somebody's uniform, and asked my buddy, "What is that thing? Who is that? What warfare pin is that?" And then that began a series of just learning about the community. And it wasn't until I'd been in the SEAL teams that I learned that anyone can apply to be an astronaut. So none of that was planned as I was a kid growing up throwing footballs in my backyard with my brother.
Yeah.
Uh, it just
Yeah,
kind
it's
of life
interesting
happened.
because I remember when I joined the Navy as well in the recruiter's office. I mean, really the only material that you saw of Navy SEALs, there was a VHS tape in the recruiter's office that you can watch that had the SEALs, but there was no internet when I joined in 92. You didn't have all this information about the SEAL team. So, I was curious about how you learned about it, how you decided to go to the teams. And once you did, the process, so you're at Annapolis, and you meet the SEAL. When did you decide, okay, I'm going to go for this? And how did that transpire?
Yeah, so at the military academies, specifically Annapolis, you can service select multiple different options in the military, right? You can be a pilot, you can be surface ships, submarines, Marine Corps, aviator, all that stuff. And what they do is try to expose the students, the midshipmen, to all of that a little bit in doses throughout your whole time, whether it be mentors that are on the staff there, or during your summers, you spend some time at different units, and you kind of try to figure out what of all these things makes most sense for me and what I like to do. And for me, that first spark of the SEAL teams, as I mentioned, when I saw my first SEAL, and then I started to go to the SEAL team PTs, and you have to do certain things to stay with different communities to have basically prerequisites in order to select that at the end at your senior year. And I maintained those, and went to the training in the summertime. But it was really my junior year when I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to pick. I drove from Annapolis down to Norfolk, Virginia, where the SEAL teams are, one weekend, and knocked on the doors at the quarterdeck. And you've been in the Navy, the weekend guys on duty, guys and gals on duty, they're just sitting there buying the time till they're handing over the watch. And so I just sat down on the quarterdeck of a couple different SEAL teams in Little Creek, and talked to those guys. And I just really felt comfortable. I thought, I can see myself doing this, and it's more than just a VHF video now. It's like real, and I think it's for me.
And then so you get selected to B.U.D.s, which is Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. It's where SEALs first go to get their first glimpse of training. What was that experience like for you? You do the prerequisites. You finally get into B.U.D.s. What happens at that point?
Yeah. So when you show up at B.U.D.s, uncertainty brings anxiety and fear, and all those emotions, right? And when you drive over the bridge from San Diego to Coronado, you have this, oh my God, I'm actually here. And then you go on to base, and you meet some folks in your class, and everybody's guilty of it, like looking around and going, okay, well, that guy's going to make it. I don't know about that guy. I'm sort of the same as that guy. But everybody's wrong, because what you can't see is what's in somebody's heart, in their head, in their mind. And that's what gets you through SEAL training. That's what gets you through every hard thing in life, whether it's SEAL training or just a battle of health in your own personal world or whatever. And I just remember walking away going, well, all I can do is do my best every day. And then so SEAL training is 6 months long. It's broken up into 3 phases or chunks. The first phase is all physical fitness. The second phase is diving. The third phase is land warfare and demolitions and things. And there's some construction guy on the other side of the wall. Sorry about that. Nothing I can do about it. There we go. Did you hear all that?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay, just keep on going. Anyway, so in first phase, about the 5th week of those 2 months is Hell Week. And the best advice I got leading into Hell Week was just make it to the next meal. They've got to feed you. Don't ever quit unless you're in the chow hall. But guess what? When you get to the chow hall, you're warm, you're fed, everything's good, there's no structure. So any thought of leaving passes you by. And
it kind of resets the clock a little bit.
Great advice. Just make it to the next meal, and that works in life too.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it resets that clock of like, oh, wait a minute, it's not so bad. And then you get out there again, you're like, but after B.U.D.s, you go on, you have a pretty eclectic career in the SEALs. And I don't know if that's the route for everybody, but you seem to have done a lot in the community. You had 2 deployments to Afghanistan post 9/11 as the ground force commander of international and U.S. combat missions. You had 2 deployments to the Med. You served as executive officer of Special Boat Team 20. You were a SEAL platoon commander for SEAL Team 3. You were also a SEAL platoon leader for the SDV, the SEAL Delivery Vehicle Unit. And then you also did some cool non-compliant shipboarding. So it seems like you had a vast array of duties while you were at a SEAL, as a SEAL. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So when you're in SEAL training and right towards the end, when you're about to graduate, you fill out these dream sheets for which SEAL team you'd like to be on. Basically, there's East Coast, West Coast, and a couple teams on each coast. And I learned about SDVs, SEAL Delivery Vehicles, when I was in SEAL training, and I just love the water. I love diving. I thought it was a super cool mission. So I filled out SDV Team 2 as my first choice in Little Creek, and that's what I got. I spent 4 years driving those mini subs. I could talk for hours about that, but you launch off of a full-size submarine out of this dry deck, this chamber that can launch the mini sub, and then you go away and do a mission and come back. Loved it. Little did I know what a great analog trainer that would be for future career as a spacewalker. It's the same concept. You're leaving you're leaving a perfectly good environment to go into a hostile one and coming back and reversing that process.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a 2-man mini sub. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's called a submersible if you want to get technical, because inside of it you're surrounded by water, so you're on scuba gear as you're operating the thing. Whereas a submarine, people tend to think it's a dry environment. You close the door and you can take your mask off. That's not the case. We're driving through the water, and it's basically moving us through the water rather than we're having to swim.
And then you guys will, and we don't have to get deep into what the mission was, but so you guys would go out to whatever your mission was, and is there a hatch? You just kind of open the door, you swim out, do your mission, you come back and drive it back to the sub? And is there like a GPS system in there, or how do you navigate?
All good questions. So you launch from the host submarine miles and miles offshore, and then you drive to the particular point where you're going, all underwater. So there's a Doppler navigation system that kind of needs the ground to bounce sonar off of and tell you how fast you're going, and then use a compass to give you your direction. There's some drift in that. It's not an exact science. So we would do different tactics, like intentionally go wide to the right so that as soon as you hit the shoreline, you know that you have to go left, for example. We did, this was back in the 90s, we did have little small handheld GPSs that you just stick your hand up out of the water and get a reset signal, and you could punch those coordinates into the onboard computer. It has since evolved, and now there's an antenna that you can set up there, and it goes automatically. But it really, really super cool mission. We could haul in other SEALs to insert them. We could haul in cargo. We could take SEALs off, other teammates off of the beach. Just a wide variety of missions. People, you can type in SDV or SEAL Delivery Vehicle into Google and learn a little bit about it.
You also deployed to Afghanistan post 9/11, and you were involved in a mission that where your unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So if you remember, in the early days of the conflict in Afghanistan, right after in early October of 2001, we knew Bin Laden was in this place called Tora Bora. We were bombing the heck out of it as a country. And we also knew that the train kind of fed to this known cave complex called the Zawar Kili Caves. And we were assigned, our SEAL platoon, to go into those caves and kind of flush them out, blow up any munitions that were there. We thought it would be a one night, like insert at sunset, do the mission all night, and come out at sunrise. Turns out we ended up staying there 9 days because it was such a vast cave complex and there was so much work to do.
What was inside of the caves? Were they actual Taliban, or was it weapons?
Yeah, so it's pretty fascinating. The United States intelligence, we knew that the cave complex was vast. We didn't know really the extent of it. And by that, I mean the main cave shafts you could drive 18-wheeler trucks in. And then there was this labyrinth of connecting caves that went to smaller caves, some just big enough for a person. Some entered into a room, like there was chow hall, there was a medical area, there was a communications area within the cave complex, there was a barracks, there was, all of it was lined on the walls with munitions of all kinds, mostly Soviet-era munitions. And we blew it all up. We had SEALs and we had some E.O.D. explosive technicians, and we used the better part of those 9 days to just try to demolish the caves and destroy the munitions.
When you joined the SEALs, this was early 90s, is that correct?
Yep, exactly. 93 when I went through training, so 94 is when I was a qualified SEAL.
So can you talk a little bit about the contrast between a pre-war SEAL versus after 9/11, when it becomes now wartime, what the mission changed to and how being a SEAL changed? Because prior to that, it was really just Vietnam era tactics that we knew as a military, because we had conflicts, but there wasn't, huge wars like what we were in with Afghanistan. So can you talk about the contrast between prior to 9/11 and then after 9/11, what it was like being a SEAL?
Yeah. The biggest takeaway for me with that was really in the mindset of preparation and training. Prior to 9/11, as a SEAL community, we took training very seriously, and we trained with all the discipline that we could muster to say, what would we do if this was a real mission? What would you do? And basing that, as you correctly suggested, off of lessons learned from conflicts in Vietnam and smaller ones along the way, Grenada, Panama, and kind of weaving those into a set of tactics that we could employ. But the individual SEALs, it was up to them to find the discipline to put yourself in the mindset of, okay, it's peaceful right now, but if we're doing this mission, it's for real. And all SEALs are pretty good about that. But I found that it changed the dynamics after 9/11, when every single SEAL platoon knew that they were going to deploy to a combat zone, and bullets were real, and the enemy, the mission was real. And not that it wasn't prior to 9/11, but it was a different kind of mindset. I don't know if I'm describing that correctly.
Sure.
But we trained on all the same tactics. We trained on land warfare. We trained in mountainous terrain. We trained in winter environments. But you just never knew for sure if you were going to use those skills. And one thing that was interesting post 9/11, our training proficiency in the water declined a little bit, and I think we're making sure that we stay true to our roots in the maritime environment now still. But I've been out of the community for a while now, so my knowledge isn't super current, but I do know that that was something that as a community we were paying attention to, like, hey, we're not quite so proficient in the water as we were prior to 9/11, so make sure we keep that tight.
Well, you were also involved in a lot of the VBSS missions, which are visit, board, search, and seizure. Is that correct?
Yep, exactly.
And those are maritime missions where SEALs will board a ship in I guess do exactly what it says: visit, board, search, and seizure. This was in the Persian Gulf. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was in the 2001 time frame when there was an embargo on ships coming out from Iraq, and as long as they stayed inside of 12 miles and didn't venture into international waters, they were safe. But as soon as they were in international waters, they could be boarded and inspected if they're violating the cargo embargoes. And so that's what we would do, is this cat and mouse game of these pirate ships that they knew they had to stay close to the shore as possible, but then there are some areas where it's shallow for many miles and they have to kind of go into international waters to stay in deep water. And then that's when we board them. And it was, like I said, this cat and mouse games of creative ways to make to prevent themselves from being boarded.
Yeah, it's kind of like when we were out in the Gulf, and we were, I worked in aviation, and part of our task was to protect the 32nd parallel line. And you would have, jets that would, come back, they would go over the line and then back over, go over the line, just kind of play this game with our pilots. I could see that happening with these ships as well. So you have, like I said, you have this eclectic career in the SEAL team. At what point, because you're an operator to the highest extreme, you're leading these teams, you're an officer in the SEAL community. When does NASA come into play? How did you learn about NASA? How did you know that you would have the opportunity to apply to become an astronaut? How does that all happen?
Yeah, in 1998, I finished up 4 years at driving those mini submarines, and I was on my way to graduate school in Boston. And so I was at grad school from 98 to 2000. And it was early in that grad school time that I met Bill Shepard, who was the first SEAL to become an astronaut. And he had gone to the Naval Academy, and he went to MIT engineering program. And I was there, and I realized, hey, my background is lining similar up to his. And he was selected as an astronaut. I didn't even know that non-pilots could apply to become an astronaut.
Right.
And so I reached out to him. He was gracious with his time and took my phone call. And then we ended up meeting in person in Houston one time around 2000. Yeah, late 2000. And through getting to know him, he explained the process to me that we hire astronauts about every 4 years. It doesn't matter what your background is. You just have to be a U.S. citizen to be a NASA astronaut and have a bachelor's degree. They've since added a master's degree requirement, but at the time I had all of the check marks, and I thought, what the heck? It just cost me some hours of time to put the application together, and we'll see what happens. I applied for the astronaut class of 2000. I had not completed graduate school. I hadn't deployed overseas to Afghanistan. 9/11 hadn't happened. So I didn't get an interview. I didn't get selected. 4 years later, 2004 astronaut class, graduate school completed. I had experience in Afghanistan. I was just a much more well-rounded applicant, and it worked out. They hired me. So 2004, I shifted gears from doing SEAL team stuff to working at NASA. I was still a active duty Navy person, but my duty station became the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Is it common for NASA to have military personnel working at NASA?
So there's kind of two answers: astronaut and non-astronaut working at NASA. Within the astronaut population, we pick, like I said, every 4 years, somewhere between 10 to 15 in the class usually, and there is no hard and fast requirement on how many are military or not. It's really what the best applicants are for that class. Now, to be truthful, the military provides a lot of really quality background and for somebody to be a really good crewmate on a spacecraft, whether that's being a pilot, whether that's operating in some other fashion. In my case, it was the SEALs. So there's a great deal of experience that comes out of the military. But that being said, we have school teachers. In my class of 14, we had 3 school teachers, a PhD researcher, former NASA engineer, aerospace engineers. A handful of us were military. Of those military, a handful were pilots, and a couple of us were not. So it's just a wide variety of folks they pick.
Do you remember well, I'm sure you remember, but where were you when you first found out that you had been accepted to the program and you've been offered this opportunity?
Yeah, this was great. It was a phone call that, it changed the direction of my life, right?
Sure.
So when you do an interview at NASA, so they have the astronaut class, as I mentioned, class of 2004. That means the summer of 2004, they want that class to show up. They back that process up by about 1.5 years and begin this long interview process. And that, if you make it to the interview, it's a week in Houston, mostly medical. There's a real sit-down interview and some other stuff where they test your robotic aptitude and other things. And I did that week-long interview in September of 2003. And the very next week, I was going on a 6-month deployment. So I went to Houston, did my interview, went overseas to Afghanistan for another 6+ month deployment. And the astronaut selection office knew that I was hard to get in touch with because I was overseas. So I received an email in late, April, 6 months later. It said, please call the astronaut selection office on Monday. And it just so happened that I was redeploying home that weekend. So I'm sitting in my house, in my kitchen in Virginia Beach. And instead, I was just about ready to call when the phone rang. And the gouge is, if it's the head of HR, whose voice it is, you're probably not going to be an astronaut. If it's the voice of the chief astronaut, there's a good chance you're going to be an astronaut. So I pick up the phone, all nervous, and he said, "Hey, Chris, this is Kent Rominger, who was the chief astronaut at NASA. We're just curious if you'd like to work with us and be an astronaut." And that changed everything. And a couple weeks later, we're selling a house, moving. And
so that's it. As soon as you get that phone call, so you're not going back to the SEAL team. Your now trajectory is working with NASA.
Yep, exactly. So you come from the military, so you understand the concept of detailers and your orders and your PCS rotating orders. I had PCS orders to take me out of the unit that I was and to go somewhere else. And NASA contacts the detailer and says, "Hey, change Cassidy's orders. He's coming to the Johnson Space Center." So they changed my orders, and instead of the moving truck still came, it just brought the stuff to Houston.
Oh, wow. And what is day one like, stepping into the Johnson Space Center? Like, you're now an astronaut. You're an astronaut candidate or astronaut? How does it work?
Yeah, you're right. You're technically an astronaut candidate, and you are that for 2 years as you go through all of the processes and training, and I can talk about that in a second. But you show up on the first day, and you're all excited, but truthfully, day one anywhere is what? You get your badge.
Right.
Where do I park? Where's my office? You got to go see the computer person and get all those things. And that's what day one was kind of like, with exception to one thing, and that was the astronaut Monday morning meeting. Every organization has a Monday morning meeting, I think, and astronauts are no different. And I remember walking into that, looking around going, there's John Young, there's so-and-so, there's all people that I knew about from the internet and from reading books. And I just had this imposter feeling, like, who the hell am I to be in this conference room right now? The other funny thing about day one, I drove home at the end of the day. My son at the time, he was 5, and he ran up and met me at the door. He knew that I was my first day as an astronaut, and he came right up and goes, "Dad, did you go to the moon today?" And I just kind of chuckled and said, "No, check with me on Thursday, kind of
Right, right.
thing.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. And what would you say? Were you able to translate any of your skills from the SEAL community to your training with NASA? Did anything kind of, uh, overlap and help you out with your training?
Yeah, very much so. The concept of being an operator in the military translates very closely, right? Like, so whether you're an operator in the SEAL teams or an aviation squadron or whatever, you don't realize it when you're young and doing it, but you're getting information, you're processing, you're communicating to your left and right and up and down your chain of command and feeding information, receiving information. It's all going into the mission execution decision matrix. And you don't know it when you're a young guy that you're part of that machine. But you just kind of become comfortable in it, talking on the radio and all those things. And so when I got to NASA, all of that was very normal to me. And so I think initially those of us with military background, not just me and the SEALs, but all of us from the military,
Sure.
had a distinct advantage in our preparation over our civilian counterparts that were coming on. But the NASA training is really solid, and in quick order, within a few months, everybody's kind of pretty well equal in that regard. But and then
Right.
we trained for spacewalks in a big pool in Houston where we put spacesuit on and submerge in the water, do spacewalks. I found that to be a very natural environment because of my time driving SCVs and mini subs. I spent hundreds of hours underwater, so that was another huge advantage for me was that comfort in the water.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then how long before you get picked to go into space? And then once you do get picked to go into space, what is the time frame to launch day?
So I got that phone call in the summer of 2004, and my first mission on the shuttle we launched in the summer of 2009. So 5 years later, the first 2 years of that, as I already mentioned, you're an astronaut candidate, so you're not going to get assigned to a mission while you're going through that basic training, and then you're effectively in line for your turn to be called. Um, you join a crew. You have in the shuttle world, you had about a year to 15 months of preparation and training, and then you go fly your mission. And that's pretty normal, 5 to 6, 7 years, depending on your waiting, where you hit the cycle for your first flight.
Was it hard getting used to that, being that coming from the SEAL community where you can get a phone call and hours later you're on a plane going to the other side of the world where everything just moves so fast? Was it hard getting used to that? Like, were you like chomping at the bit going, I want to do this. I want to do this.
Well, you're certainly chopping at the bit, ready to go, but there's so much training to it, and the unique thing about training to be an astronaut is you can't go to space to train for it. You have to train in analog environments on the ground, and we come up with that in different scenarios. There's no one room that you go to that emulates everything. You have a pool for one thing, you have simulators for another, you have static displays for other things, and you have to kind of piece it all together. So you feel like how there's so much to learn. So I never felt in those first years like, oh my God, I gotta. You're just waiting for that call, but the whole time you're trying to make sure that you're as trained as you can be. So it wasn't. I did not feel like I missed that dynamic, fast paced, here comes a phone call kind of thing.
Yeah. And then, so you flew in the space shuttle. You also flew in a Russian, and I'll probably butcher, is it Soyuz rocket?
Soyuz, you got it. Yep.
Soyuz rocket. And for that mission, part of, obviously we know there's training. You have to learn how to spacewalk and wear the suit, but you had to also go through additional training and learn Russian because you were going up in a Russian rocket where all the controls were in Russian. How hard was that?
Honestly, Slade, that was the hardest thing for me about astronaut training. I'm very hands-on. My brain thinks mechanically, and I can do stuff and figure things out if I just pick up things and I can look at it and figure out how it works. But that side of the brain is not the one that helps you to conjugate verbs in Russian. And so that was a struggle for me. And I felt like we take, as astronauts, we take one-on-one language lessons with an instructor right when you show up, about 3 times a week, 2 hours at a session, and
Oh, wow.
the whole time you're there. And I just felt like I never was getting there until I went over and lived in Moscow with a family for about 6 weeks. And that kind of tripped me over the threshold where I could feel like I was going to get there. But man, oh man, it's hard. It was hard for me. Other people just soak it up and it comes right out.
That would be hard for me too. I'm the same way like you. I'm very mechanical, but when it comes to languages, that's hard for me. I also wanted to ask you because, in your old profession as a SEAL, your job is to really go into the belly of the beast and fight our country's enemies. But in the space program, you're also working hand in hand with astronauts or cosmonauts from other countries. And sometimes our governments don't see eye to eye here on Earth. Is it easy to put politics aside when you're up in the space station with people from other countries, and your mission is really it's for the betterment of mankind? Is it easy to kind of set politics aside?
So the most helpful thing in that regard is we know the astronauts and cosmonauts from the other countries on a personal level long before the mission starts. The Japanese, the Canadians, and the European astronauts all move with their families to Houston when those crews are training. The cosmonauts stay living in Russia, but they themselves come over oftentimes with their families to Houston for a month or two at a time, and we go over to Moscow. In fact, NASA has a small set of condominium style buildings there that we live in when we're there for a couple months at a time. So I knew all of my crewmates and their families and their kids and had many meals together long before. So with that kind of personal friendship, I found it much easier to compartmentalize the tensions between the countries. And this was more prevalent in my last mission was in 2020 when it was really starting to begin the tension between the countries that we see now, particularly Russia and the United States, I'm talking about clearly. And but those individual people, it was no problem to have dinner with them. And it depends on the crew's comfort level. With my crew in 2013, we had a thing where I had no problem asking them very pointed questions about politics in their country, and same with them. Crew in 2020, it just wasn't the same. We just sort of stayed away from that topic, and that worked for us. Yeah.
And you've been up in space 377 days. Is that correct?
Yep.
Wow. And then 60 hours of that, I believe I read, was outside the space station.
Yeah.
How fast are you moving and how do you hold on? Because I've seen the International Space Station through a telescope go over my house one time, and it was hauling butt. So do you feel that up there, or are you not feeling how fast you are moving?
Right. So you're going 17,500 miles an hour, which is a big giant number. What does that really mean? 5 miles every second. That's how fast you're traveling, which is really hard to get your brain wrapped around moving at that speed. Here's the thing though, if you're driving down the highway in your car and you roll your window down, stick your hand out, it blows back hard, right? And we've all done that thing where we move our hand in the wind. But all those air molecules hitting your hand are what's causing that force of your hand to move back. When you exit the spacecraft, you're going that speed, but there's no air molecules around you. So you feel no resistance. There's nothing that gives you any physical sensation about that motion. You just look down and you see the world going between your toes at 5 miles a second. Like, oh, there's Houston. Oh, there's Atlanta. Oh, wow. There's New York. There's Washington, D.C. There's New York City. There's Boston. You're over the ocean. So visually, you get a sense for the speed just because you know geography on the planet, but there's no physical sensation of that speed. And in terms of holding on, your brain is looking down, telling you you're on the top. You're on the top of a really tall skyscraper, and if you let go, you're falling. So you're fighting this emotion with your brain visually, but then if you let go, you're moving at the same rate the spacecraft is. So even though your body and the spacecraft are going 5 miles a second, there's no relative speed difference. So you let go and you pretty much are still looking at the same piece of metal.
How long did it take you to get used to that?
Oh, about 60 hours.
And
No, you settle in pretty quick, but initially it's like, whoa, this is
yeah,
this is real.
I can imagine when I was watching the documentary, I was sweating, because there's so much pressure to be able, they were trying to cut a wire and they have these huge gloves on and they're using these huge tools. And they were like, if they cut the wrong wire, there was no going back. The mission was over and it would like ruin this whole mission that we were doing for years and years and years. And I was like, the pressure, how do you deal with the pressure of that? I mean, I imagine you do a lot of training, but still when it comes down to the moment, um, how hard is it to maneuver in those suits and use the tools and do the things that you need to do while walking in space outside the space station?
Yeah, Slade, you have a very insightful question because when you're a new astronaut, or when I was later in my career when I was training other astronauts, you do all of this training in Houston with mock-ups of the real thing. In the pool, sometimes those mock-ups are plastic boxes, and it's easy. And this kind of goes back to our initial conversation of what the difference was training for SEALs prior to 9/11 and after 9/11. It's really, you got to really focus to remember that this plastic box represents a multi-million-dollar thing that you're going to put your hands on when you get on the real, when you really get to space. And I remember the first time my first spacewalks, we had to replace some big batteries on the outside of the space station. They're big, heavy, and expensive. And I remember holding it in my hand, and it's all bright and shiny and perfect, pristine, and the serial number was 0001. I'm like, holy mackerel! Like, it is game on, and it becomes real, and all that goes back into training, and how the more realistic you make training and make you think about training, the better off you'll be when it's execution time.
Sure, absolutely.
And that applies not just being an astronaut, but everything we do, right?
Right, absolutely. The more you train, the more you put effort into something, the easier the execution becomes.
Yep.
Is there anything that you trained for that once you got to space, you were like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't going as planned? And that could be, sleeping, going to the bathroom, doing, whatever. Was there anything that the first time you went up, you were like, this isn't like what I trained for on Earth?
Yeah. The technical stuff of all the technical aspects of training, we can do pretty well in Houston. So there was, I don't want to say very little surprises, but, I had thought through, talked with the engineers and my crewmates about different what ifs, and that all pretty much went as planned. There's some exceptions. But the living part, as you suggest, there's no way to experience it other than to get there. So the first time you pee, the first time you sit on the toilet for number 2, the first time you drink a bag of water, it's all learning. And you quickly get it, right? It's not like, oh my God, how am I ever going to figure out how to drink water in space? But it's different than what you're used to. And so you just kind of have to adapt to that. The truth of the matter is, all of your bodily things are the same. Like your fingernails grow the same, your hair grows the same speed. If you got to pee, you know it. If you're tired, you know it. When you brush your teeth, or your teeth still get dirty, you got to brush them. So, all that stuff is very much what you're used to. It's just a different environment.
Can you talk a little bit about the re-entry process? I remember when I was a kid and I went to Cape Canaveral, one of the demonstrations they took a tile from the space shuttle and they took a blowtorch and they just burned the crap out of the tile and nothing happened to it. And they were showing how the re-entry process, when you go through this burn up process, that's what keeps the astronauts in the shuttle safe. Can you talk about a little what the re-entry process is like and going through that fireball and, what you're feeling in that moment?
Yeah, the simplest way to describe it is, on launch, all the bad, scary stuff that can kill you, where is it? It's behind you. On re-entry, all the bad, scary stuff that can kill you, where is that? Directly in front of you, and you have to go through it. So, as you correctly pointed out, the heat shield is the most important thing in your life for those 10 minutes. And then the parachute becomes the most important thing in your life. But the heat shield is really interesting. In fact, when I sent in my application to become an astronaut was in 2003, when Space Shuttle Columbia Columbia had the accident. And what happened there, if you can picture the orange fuel tank and the shuttle on the side of it, chunks of foam fell off the orange fuel tank and at high velocities had enough energy to poke holes in that tile that you saw when you were a kid and cracked a hole. And they did the whole mission in space without knowing they had holes in their wings.
Oh, wow.
And then they re-entered, and the plasma burned through, melted the metal, ripped the wing off, and then that was the end of the mission. So we knew from that, you learn your lessons in blood, and we knew that if we knew there was no chunks of foam missing, then we could be reasonably assured that the tile was intact. And so that was one of my first jobs on my very first mission, was as soon as we launched, to unbuckle, take my helmet off, take my gloves off, take a camera out, and take pictures of the external fuel tank so that the engineers could study it to make sure that there was no missing chunks of foam anywhere. Oh, and wow. That's when it became really real to me, like, oh, wow, this is an important job. This is everything about this is our survival depends on that heat shield. And then sure. In a capsule like the Soyuz, it's a much smaller surface area that the heat shield has to cover, and it's at the bottom of the capsule, and you burn through the atmosphere, and then out comes a parachute.
Wow. And then speaking of important jobs, can you talk about what is the job of an astronaut while not traveling to space, right? Because it seems that there's more astronauts than there are space flights. So what does an astronaut do when not selected for flight and they're back at either the Johnson Space Center or another space center? What are they doing?
Yeah, so we all live in Houston at the Johnson Space Center, live and work there. And I was an astronaut for a little over 17 years and flew three missions in those years. So you do a quick math, it's like 5 to 6 years between missions. And so what do we do, to your point? We support ongoing missions. We work in mission control. We work with commercial space partners like SpaceX and Boeing and Blue Origin on if they need input on what would be on crew things. The engineers, they can solve the technical problems, but like how a spacesuit functions, where do you want the switches and knobs, how a display should be organized and inside the capsule, and all of that. The Artemis mission right now that's flying around the moon has a capsule associated with it that will then take my former colleagues around the moon. And that capsule design, the Orion capsule design, has been an ongoing project for the last, don't quote me on the year, but decade or so, just in early stages, kind of conceptually, and then more to the real metal belt bending kind of thing. So we do, the short answer to your question is we do all kinds of jobs related to ongoing mission support.
Yeah, I noticed in the documentary that while your colleagues were in space and they had this mission that they had to figure out how to cut these wires and use these special tools, and the engineers had to make these special tools, and you actually went into the pool and were testing it so that then they can send those tools up into space. So I guess that's one case study right there where
perfect example.
Testing things on the ground.
Yeah, perfect example.
Yeah. And then I was going to ask you, we kind of talked about this a little bit, and you just kind of mentioned it. What are your thoughts on private companies getting into the space travel business, like Amazon and Virgin Galactic?
Oh, I'm all for it. I think that there's a couple of reasons why. One is it's exciting the nation, exciting the world on what's the possibilities of space flight. And with that excitement comes the national will to further fund and explore space, which is what NASA's doing. So I don't think there's this competition between the commercial companies and the government organizations like NASA. It's really a partnership. Like, I personally don't see a business case that's successful for one company to send people to Mars. It's so expensive and just money sunk in. What's the return to the company? So I think a successful Mars mission really will be a government space program and probably a combination of multiple nations partnering on that mission. And the success in low Earth orbit of the commercial companies, which there is a solid business case for those companies, their success is enabling NASA and the government organizations to focus its time and resources on the harder, more long duration, more expensive missions like going to the moon and back to the moon and onto Mars.
Do you think one day that we'll get, I mean, maybe not anytime soon, but do you think one day we'll get to the point where space travel is like going to an airport, or at least you'll be able to go to the moon, and it will be less expensive, and people will have that opportunity to maybe not go to the moon, but travel into outer space just to see the Earth from that view?
I really do. It seems kind of foreign to us right now, but just think, like a little over 100 years ago, the Wright brothers flew, and now we're talking about, we all take the internet for granted, and if you got to fly at Thanksgiving across the country to see your family, it's possible. And so 100 years from now, the sky's the limit, right? And we're in the early stages of that. You can buy for on the order of a couple $100,000 a ticket to do we call it suborbital, where you launch, you get 20-minute total mission. A couple of those minutes are free floating and a view of the Earth, and then you land right back where you took off. Or orbital spaceflight, which is substantially more risky and therefore substantially more costly, and to the company and to the tourists. But people have already done it. And so we're in the dawn of space exploration, space tourism, and it's only going to get cheaper and more widespread.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. All right, here's the $1 million question. You ready, Chris?
Yep.
Is it possible, or have you seen evidence of alien life form out there? Is it possible?
It's possible for sure. I haven't seen it, and I don't think in our solar system it exists. But if you think how vast the universe is, like it's infinite, right? So however big you think it is, it's a little bit bigger. Somewhere out there, there's a place that can support life. I just believe it. Whether they look like us or look like little green guys or ET, who knows? But I think there is something out there.
Do you ever ask yourself this question? I used to do this when I was a kid. I would mess with my mind a lot, because I would say as you say, it's just vast, it's infinite. What happens if you have a rocket and you have all the fuel that you need, you have all the food that you need, and you just keep going and going and going? Where does it go?
Yeah. And that blows, it really warps your brain. You're not really, you don't know what to deal with that. Right?
Yeah. I used to think about that all the time as a kid, and just like, I just love space, and I love what you do.
I guess it's kind of like time. Not to get too geeky on you, but December 31st rolls around. Where does it go? It goes to January 1st. It just keeps going. Time is the only thing I can think of that puts it in a place where my brain can deal with it.
Right. I did want to ask you, you retired from the military and from NASA last year. You are now doing something equally as important. You have been bestowed this honor of being the CEO and president of the Medal of Honor Foundation. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and what your mission is now and what you're doing?
The Medal of Honor Museum Foundation is really three aspects of what we're doing. We're building a museum for the Medal of Honor recipients. Happens to be located in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Talk about that in a second. In that museum will be housed a leadership institute. And the third aspect is a monument on the Mall in D.C. And so the Medal of Honor, as you know, Slade, it's the nation's highest award for valor on the battlefield. There's been 3,500 awards of the medal since Abraham Lincoln put the medal into effect in 1861. 65 of those are living today, and they're not getting any younger. So we're really motivated to get this thing built. And that's why it's not in D.C. The organization, before I arrived about a little over 2 years ago, they did a study on if we put it in D.C., how long would it take, and what real estate would we have access to? It's a whole process. It probably would have taken a couple dozen years, 20 or so years to get it done. So I said, hey, why don't we just do a monument there, focus on a bricks and mortar thing somewhere else in the country, and centrally located, close to the airport. There are two, Cowboy Stadium, Ranger Stadium, Six Flags, all located nearby. It's a great place for it.
And when is the projected date that it will be open?
2 years from right now. We're targeting Veterans Day of 2024. We've started construction now. Outside my window, you can see the crane moving stuff around, and but we're still 2 years. That's the building, and then the museum content fabrication
As a veteran, I'm sure do you feel this added pressure to make sure you get it right?
Well, not just as a veteran, but as a person part of the organization, we don't want to let anybody down, particularly the really generous donors, both businesses and families that have supported us. We really want to hit the mark. And what we think that mark is inspiring people through really cool stories. You know, you've all been to a museum where you read a plaque and you go read another plaque, and that doesn't so much inspire you. So we need it to be a destination. We need it to be experiential. We need it to resonate with all ranges of people, but all themed on normal people doing amazing things when they needed to do it most, and inspiring folks that, hey, I might not be on the battlefield any opportunity to do that, but I need courage to have a hard conversation with my teenage kid or whatever, try to inspire people in their normal life. Anyways, that's our guidepost, and that's the measure that we're trying to hit and make sure we do it right.
Wow. And if people want to donate, where can they send donations to?
Yeah, mohmuseum.org is our website. You can learn about the project. There's some videos on what the building will look like and a description of our institute and the monument. And then there's a donate now page up there. So appreciate everybody's interest, just even if it's helping spread the word.
Sure. No, it's such a great cause, such a great project. It's amazing what you've chosen to do with your life, Chris. You've dedicated yourself to a life of service. You continue to serve and honor our American heroes. You're a legend in my book. And I thank you for all you do for our country and mankind. I appreciate your time, man, and you're just a special human being. Good luck with the project. If there's, I know I'm just a small part, but if there's anything that I can do to help you, I'm just a phone call away. I really love this project that you're doing. So kudos to you and congratulations. And thank you so much for being a part of this podcast today.
I appreciate all those kind words, Slade. It was a pleasure being with you. Thanks for your interest and thanks for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.